Hello. Today we're going to be talking about Hans Holbein, a renowned painter under the order of King Henry VIII of the Tudor court. We're going to understand how he came to be in such a prestigious position, the nature of the relationships he cultivated along the way, as well as understanding and viewing a little bit of his pictorial style for which he is so widely renowned, both in his own time as well as today. Hans Holbein the Younger, as he shares the same name with his father, was born in Augsburg, Germany in the year 1497 or 8 to an established family of artists. Both his father, again, Holbein the Elder, and his uncle, Sigmund, were responsible for many paintings, woodcuts, and productions of other mediums in their workshop that they co-owned in Augsburg. Seemingly having them forego a traditional artistic education, Holbein the Elder and presumably his brother Sigmund taught both of the Holbein boys. Here we can see that this is Hans, our titular fellow, on the right at about age 14. And again, their father produced this particular sketch. They were taught, the boys, that is to say, were taught in the late Gothic style, and it would be during trips to both France and Italy that Hans the Younger would pick up on certain motifs and stylings from the Renaissance period in particular. We can see later on how, in particular, this image here, many of the detailings, especially the attention to architectural detailings, as well as how distinct each character, whether in the front or the background, are portrayed with such a unique amount of detail. This is something that Holbein the Younger ultimately walks away with from his father's teachings. Regardless, although they co-owned the workshop, the elder Holbeins, that is, they began to go bankrupt after economic shifts in the town of Augsburg changed. Various local guildsmen were suffering, and Holbein the Elder was no exception, falling into crippling debt. Even though he tried to take out a loan from his brother Sigmund, there was no way he could repay it. So the workshop shuttered and ultimately closed. It was shortly after this that Sigmund moved to Switzerland, and Holbein the Younger followed, moving to Basel, where he would continue to do various artworks. In particular, although it was not perhaps as wealthy nor opulent as Augsburg, Basel was known for its printing industry, which some artists were convinced was at the time, and given the circumstances, a better return on investment and earned one a greater profit, as well as being home to a unique academic scene. In particular, Desiderius Erasmus, an internationally renowned scholar and humanist by this point, had arrived 1 year prior to Holbein moving to Basel. So it was no coincidence that the two had met and had taken a liking for each other. And it was quickly that Erasmus would soon commission Holbein to do many things, including up to 8 portraits. We can see this one here in particular has that unique attention to that architectural styling that his father had showed him. And of course, Holbein the Younger was partial to putting in various symbolic elements such as these books, because Erasmus was such a stately and renowned scholar. So those catered hand in hand. These illustrations in particular were for were for Erasmus's book In Praise of Folly, thus making Holbein published. Although his older brother did it first, he unfortunately passed away in 1519, so he did not have much time to become a full artist. Meanwhile, Holbein was also doing various murals and other commissions for members such as the mayor of Basel. However, it was in the year 1522 that Reformation had begun to take hold in Basel in particular, as well as various other nations, thus putting essentially a freeze to the painting of religious artworks on which Hans was still largely reliant for his source of income. So it was upon a letter of recommendation from Erasmus that Hans the Younger would go to England, and it was here that he was introduced to Thomas More, who of course was a right-hand man of King Henry VIII. More on that in a little bit, but in particular, we know that that More was in particular a favorite of or was in favor of the Catholic Church, and that the Reformation was not something he necessarily agreed with. So in particular, we have this miniature here, which was commissioned shortly before More was sent to the scaffolds to be hanged for both treason and heresy, largely, I think, because he failed to submit to the oath of supremacy, which would mean that More recognizes King Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England. It was also during, backpedaling a bit, it was also during More's stay or excuse me, Hans's stay at More's household, that he would come into various learned and high-ranking members of the English community. In particular, Sir Henry Guildford here was how Holbein acquired his first royal commission, that being at Greenwich Palace, or excuse me, Greenwich Palace in 1527. It was here that him and this gentleman, Nicholas Kratzer, who was the um, astronomer for King Henry VIII as well, would form a working relationship. But more importantly, at Greenwich, they were both commissioned to design the paintings for various ceilings and archways in preparation of the arrival of French ambassadors. The two, that being Kratzer and Holbein, would go on to form a unique working relationship, the former of which driving many designs for things that Kratzer would then invent, such as clocks and various other devices. For a brief period of time, Holbein returned to his home in Basel, primarily to make sure that his citizenship would not have been revoked during his stay in London. However, upon his return in 1532, change had soon hit England in many ways, both in terms of religion and many other things. It was around this point that King Henry VIII was attempting to annul his marriage with Catherine of Aragon. But in addition to that, King Henry was also trying to break away from the Roman Catholic Church. And so this was something that Thomas Cromwell, again, another right-hand man to King Henry, was also trying to orchestrate from kind of behind the scenes. And Cromwell would soon become one of Holbein's largest clients. In particular, we can see here that he is painted as the Earl of Essex, or that is his title at this point. And we can see that he's wearing that fur coat that he isn't technically supposed to be wearing. Moreover, we also know that Cromwell was in charge of putting out lots of certain religious propaganda pieces. In particular, he had Holbein commissioned to do a title page for the Miles Coverdale translation of the Bible to English. In addition to this, Hans Holbein had also settled right outside of the Steelyards of London. So it was at this point that he was in contact with many members of the Hanseatic League, a German trade guild, which had an outpost in London, again in the Steelyards, that he was made privy to the situation between King Henry and his soon-to-be second queen, Anne Boleyn. So it was at this point, because the guildsmen were so in favor, perhaps, that Anne was soon to be queen, that they put Hans in contact with her and various social circles that were in support of Anne Boleyn. And so Holbein was uniquely invited to go and paint Anne Boleyn in her private chambers in a nightgown of sorts. And while that portrait is no longer surviving because it was burned in a fire somewhere, we have various sketches. While this one on here in particular is a presumed sketch, but there is a certain likeness between the two. We know for certain this is Anne Boleyn, that there was a certain degree of trust between Holbein and other members of the court. And in particular, once that marriage was up and over with, meaning Henry had her executed, he was soon led to his third wife, Jane Seymour here. Holbein, of course, by this point had a bit of a shift in his portrait style. In particular, he focused more so on the nature and physical position of his sitters rather than their background, which was something that we saw earlier in Erasmus's portrait. There was a greater attention to other symbols. Here we see a reduction of that, instead more plain backgrounds and a greater emphasis on the items that they are wearing. In particular, we have Edward VI here. As we know, that was Jane Seymour's son and Henry's only legitimate male son at this point. However, unfortunately, it was shortly after childbirth that Jane Seymour died, and that is very unfortunate. But Edward VI continued to live on. In the search for a fourth wife and perhaps to assure a stronger alliance between the nations of Germany and England, Cromwell had found somehow Anne of Cleves, who was a German princess. Now, I highlight this one here because it's rather interesting from various ways. Unlike what we've seen before, many of Holbein's previous sitters were painted in sort of a three-quarters perspective or some kind of profile. However, Anne of Cleves markedly breaks this tradition because she is painted directly head on, directly centered in the canvas, which is kind of strange. And there may be a reason for this. Although, again, Cromwell was a big proponent of the marriage, perhaps because of assuring the relationship between two nations or for other ulterior motives, we know that her family, that being Anne of Cleves' family, was also in favor of her being married to the king. However, they had never met in person. So all that King Henry had to go on was Holbein's depiction of Anne of Cleves. And although we see her here, it's up to debate as to why exactly she's positioned such in a front-on angle. And Holbein possibly could have painted her situated in this exact way to suggest a certain plainness. Even something about her face and her expression here are very demure and modest, even though, again, there is great attention to be drawn to the jewelry that she's adorned in, as well as her outfit, again, drawn in very nice, or excuse me, rendered in great detail. It's really her face that's kind of almost in the same way that the Mona Lisa is kind of demure. There's something about her expression that's kind of hidden. So this would come back to bite Cromwell. Surprisingly enough, Henry found this particular rendition of Anne of Cleves to be particularly beguiling. So it was after this that he had a miniature of her commissioned, again by Holbein. We can see it down here. Um, However, upon meeting in person, Henry was markedly disappointed by her appearance, being even more plain than this, if you can believe that. So much of that blowback went on Cromwell, and the two essentially had a falling out, and that irreparably, excuse me, damaged Cromwell's reputation. Not only this, it would be a few short years after which that he was ousted from the court and later executed. This damaged Holbein's career to a great extent, but he was still commissioned the royal painter. So again, it's interesting to note that he survived both Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, who were very close to the king. Um, but he himself, Holbein, did not receive any blame for apparently depicting Anne of Cleves in a particular way that was more flattering than she was in physical appearance. Moreover, I decided to include this small miniature here again, which may or may not be depicting Catherine Howard, but there is some research that suggests it could be as well Anne of Cleves, although the jury is, I guess, continues to remain out on that one. And finally, here we have King Henry VIII, and this portrait here is, of course, a self-portrait of Hans Holbein the Younger, excuse me. And of course, we can see Henry here is in a very stately position in both drawings. Again, we can see more of this latter style, where it's just a more simple background depicting Henry and his clothing and his cap, so to speak, and lots of the jeweled details on his outfit are given lots of great detail. This one here on the left is much more stately, and between his armor and perhaps his just other various robusures, he looks very regal as he is intended to do. But there's a greater emphasis on the background. We can see a greater rendering of detail, a little bit of this column or perhaps molding as it might be. Now, we don't know much about the relationship between these two, but what we do know is that uniquely, Hans Holbein was allowed great access to Henry when he was available, which was something that not many others, not even other members of his own court, could necessarily say. In particular, they often met to discuss the nature of various works. And it was, of course, Holbein who was also commissioned to do various other designs for jewelry and the like under the king's request. Um, Perhaps one of the final works that Holbein was invited to do was some work at Nonsuch Palace. However, this was completed after the death of both of these figures here, and it is suggested that perhaps Hans drafted some materials for a fireplace or a hearth of sorts in that palace. But once again, neither of them saw it alive to its completion. And that is most of what I have to say about the relationship between Hans and the various courtiers of Henry VIII. Thank you very much.